grab your Bibles, grab your notes. We're one of those churches. We're weird like this. We want you to have an open Bible. That doesn't happen all over the place. I know that. So whether it's digital device or paper, didn't bring one today, grab one out of the chair in front of you. I'm going to be in the book of Genesis. We're going to talk about things that get tangled. Orange extension cord. Anybody else? You put it away, all wrapped up neatly. And when you go to use it, it doesn't matter how you unfold that thing, it ends up in a knot. Doesn't it? Is it just me? Okay. Gold necklaces, ladies. You hang them, and it doesn't matter how you pull them, like they in knots. I don't know about you, but I think every single one of us that have those white earbuds, yeah, 30 seconds. You could wrap them, put them in the case, or put them in your backpack, or wherever you put them. But when you pull them out, I don't know what happens in those 30 seconds, but they come out tangled, and it takes you forever to get them undone. Well, I have something that not all of you are going to relate with, but some of you will. So let me see if you'll get this. Are there any people here who fish for bass? Bass fishermen, raise your hand. Really? I'm in the wrong part of the country. I've known that for a long time, but other than that, okay. This is a fishing pole, all right? Wow, we're going to have to start from like zero here. There's a couple different kinds of reels. One are called spin reels. It's the kind where that kind of wire bail, you kind of open it and you hold the string with your finger and you cast it. Those don't get tangled very much. This right here is called a bait caster, all right? This is how this works. You're all still okay right now? I didn't lose you yet, right? This is a fishing pole. Here's how this works. Like, it's not going anywhere, but the minute that I hit this button right here, it puts it in free spool. You got that? The only way that I can stop it is my finger has to be on the spool there. So let me reel it back up. So here's the trick. You have to click it to free spool, and then you have to launch it and release your thumb at just the right time. And when it hits the water, just before it hits the water, you have to put your thumb back on it. Because if you don't, that spool's just going to keep doing this, but it's not going anywhere, and it creates this thing called a bird's nest, all right? Can I show this to you real quick? Well, since there's no fishermen in the room, I'm like the most experienced guy in the room, so this is going to be perfect. This is just how you do this. The truth is, I'm terrible at this, but okay. Are you ready? Let's just aim right back there. Jerry, you ready? Catch this. It has a hook on it, so just, all right, here we go. You ready? We're just going to, okay. Here's the problem, though. I threw it really soft. It's only like 20 feet out there, and every fisherman knows this. The big one is just a little farther out, and that's kind of how that works. So we got to try it again, and this is where it all goes wrong. Because every fisherman's like, I just got to get it a little bit farther because there's a bigger fish out there. So when they try and throw it harder, the spool spins faster, and you get into issues. So let's just try it one more time. I'm going to try not to hurt anybody here. Oh, see, that's where the big one lives, right there. And notice, there's no bird's nest, because if you do it wrong, watch this, it looks like this. See that? Now, that looks like kind of a mediocre, maybe even an easy one to get out. I don't know what happened in this next picture. Like, what did that guy do? Because the only way you solve that one is with scissors and a knife. And you're like, done, we're just going to start over. Nancy, go back to the first picture real quick. So this is how you get this knot undone. You actually have to pull on the right string. I mean, the one that's actually holding the knot. Because what you can't do, and mind you, I've done this, and I've had a lot of unholy moments fishing, because when you get this, you're thinking, I could be catching fish right now, and I'm not, because I'm doing this dumb knot. And so instead of just starting to pull at things, you actually have to pull on the right string to get it untangled. Because if you pull on the wrong string, all you're doing is cinching down that knot even tighter. Did you get it? You got to pull on the right string. And then maybe there's a second one you need to pull, and then pull the third one through. Like, you just got to pull the right string in the right order. And this isn't a series on fishing. This is a series about knots in our souls. And what are the strings that we need to pull to release the knots in our souls? So here's what I want you to get. If you have your notes, pull those out real quick. I want to make sure that we all understand what we're talking about when we're talking about knots in our souls. It looks like this. Knots in our souls they come from past negative experiences, and every knot has a face. What do I mean by that? You remember when that person promised that they would do that thing with you, for you, and they didn't do that, and you just went, see, I knew that about people. You just can't trust people. See, your dad promised to do something, your mom promised to do something when you were a little kid, they didn't do it, and it puts something in your soul that you just know you can't trust people now. And the question is, well, you should be able to trust people to some degree. So how do you pull on the strings of that distrust to get it untangled so that you can have healthy relationships where you can trust people? Well, what happens when that one person said that thing to you that you're worthless, that you're never going to amount to anything? You write the storyline, right? Because every single one of us, we have a knot in our soul. And here's the truth. This is the important part. And every knot has a face. Meaning the person who said that, did that, wounded you, hurt you, their face is connected to that. And here's my invitation for these 5 weeks that we're going to talk about this. If a face comes to mind, would you not just don't disregard it? Pay attention to it. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to know why it's there, but just sit on that and just be like, God, as I'm reading this story in the Bible about knots in this person's soul that we'll get into in just a minute, like this person's face comes to mind. God, why is that? And you might already know, and it might be a knot in your soul that you've tried to get rid of for a long time and you just haven't been able to, and I wonder if we're pulling on the right strings, and we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But don't miss this too. Sometimes the face that's attached to the knot in your soul is your face. Because it wasn't about someone who hurt you. This falls under the category of regret. You did something that you knew violated your own moral standards. You said, I do, and you didn't. You promised you would, and you didn't. And you did something that just, it violated something that you knew was wrong. I'm not even talking about God's standards. I'm just talking about, something that you committed to do. You know was the right thing, and you're like, you just didn't do it. And so in your own soul, your knot might be your own face. And you can tell it's a knot because, when you just, the minute I started talking about that, like your pulse beat just kind of went up. It kind of got hotter in the room, and you're like, yeah, man, if I could forget that. I've been trying years to forget that. And it just bothers you. A knot in our stomach is often a knot in our soul. And so maybe it's you. And so don't ignore that. Just say, hey, God, why is that there? And here's why this is so critical. It's because when we have knots in our souls, we react out of those things. Can I give you just a couple examples? And I think they're in your notes there as well. There are a couple of examples about how we respond when we have, untangled. We haven't yet untangled the knots in our souls. Here's a couple. One's explosive anger. Have you ever had someone say something to you or cut you off or whatever it is that made you mad, but for some reason your reaction to this situation was this big, even though it was this big, and they said this and you did this, and you should have been here too, but it didn't. You went from 0 to 90 in like 2 seconds. Those are connected to some experiences that you've had. Bitterness. Often connected to experiences we've had. Self-hate, when someone said, hey, you're worthless, you can't, I don't think you'll ever amount to anything. When you get that, instead of turning around and going, no, I am actually worth something, it turned into a self-hatred. Oftentimes addiction comes from this. We're wounded and we just don't like the pain and we don't want to deal with that. So instead of pain, we just want pleasure. So we take pain, cover it by pleasure. And then when that pleasure wears off, there's still the pain there. So we're going to cover it by more pleasure. When you keep covering pleasure over pain, that's called addiction. Confusion. Sometimes we're confused, like, why do we do what we do? Like, how come I keep dating the same kind of person? Never quite works out for me, but why do I keep doing the same kind of thing that I'm doing in these relationships? And yet the relationships, I always walk away wounded. And, well, why do you do what you do? Well, it's probably connected to a knot that might be in your soul. Repetitive broken relationships. The inability to connect with people. Loneliness, depression. Are we excited about this series yet? Woo! Loneliness, depression. All right, knots in our souls. Past pain. Whoa! Don't stop coming for the next 4 weeks, okay? Don't leave me alone in the room by myself, all right? We're going to walk through this in, I think, a pretty healthy way. We're not going to over-dramatize it, but some of you've been through some pretty big things in your life. Knots in your souls are pretty significant, and rightfully so. Others of you, when you think about this, you're like, you know what? My knots are pretty minimal. No matter what you've been through, I'm going to share a story about a guy who had such unbelievable knots in his own soul because of his experience in life. So here's what I want you to do. Open your Bibles, go to Genesis. Easy book to find. First book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 37. Some of you know his story. This guy's name is Joseph. But you might not know kind of recognize the wounding that went on in his life and know it in the context of like the knots of your soul and how to get untangled. His dad's name is Jacob. He also goes by the name Israel, okay? His dad does. And so if you see the name Israel or Jacob, it's the same person. Here's Joseph's story. It starts when he's at the age of 19. Chapter 37, verse 2. Y'all there? That was a question. Y'all there? Awesome. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Stop for just a minute. His dad, Jacob or Israel, has multiple wives, and they have sons, and so these are his half-brothers. And he goes out there in the field and kind of visits them and comes back and snitches on his half-brothers. Tells on them and just brings a bad report. We don't know if it's true or whether it's false and he just made it up, but there's something there that he has to tell his dad about how bad his brothers are. Verse 3, now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he'd been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Hey, listen, Joseph's issues about being offensive to his brothers, about being a snitch. He wasn't helping his own cause, but his dad didn't help him either. What did it say? He was the favorite. Dad played favorites. Not only that, made him this ornate robe. You've probably heard this story if you ever went to church as a little kid. Joseph in his multicolored coat. And Dad did not help him out. And the brothers, they hated him. They could not speak a kind word to him. The interesting thing is like, Joseph doesn't help himself out in this. Look at the very next verse, verse 5. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this. I had a dream. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaves rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Don't tell your brothers these kind of things, even if they're true. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said to them. Joseph, you're an idiot. Like, really? Even if you had the dream and you're going to go tell your brothers, hey, just wanted you to know, hey, I know I'm the youngest, but one of these days, I'm going to rule over you. I mean, you probably, if you grew up with brothers, multiple brothers, maybe you had this kind of thing, like, hey, I'm better than you are. This takes it up a whole notch, like a whole level higher. Where it's Joseph's arrogance and his offense at his brothers. And you know how the story unfolds, right? His brothers hate him so much that there's a story that comes out where his dad, Jacob, sends Joseph out to the fields in a distant land to go visit his brothers who are watching over the flocks. And they can see him come in over the hills, and they're like, oh, it's Joseph, that piece of trash, half-brother of ours. And they devise a plan to kill him. And one of the brothers, Reuben, he says this. He goes, he's our own flesh and blood. You can't kill him. He goes, let's do this. Let's throw him in this pit. That a cistern had kind of a small opening, and it would kind of go this direction. And once you were in, there's no way you're crawling up out of that. They're like, let's throw him in there. And Reuben's plan was this. He's going to come back and rescue his brother and take him back to his dad. But before this all works out, the brothers, it's weird. They throw him in the pit, and the scripture says this. And then they sat down to have a meal. You were just devising a plan to kill your brother. And you were just decided, well, we're not going to kill him. We're going to throw him in this pit and just let him rot away here. Are you guys hungry? Let's have a meal. And that's what they do. And all of a sudden, over the hills, this caravan of traders come in. They're trading spices and goods with Egypt. And they're on their way to Egypt. And they go, hey, instead of us killing him, we don't want that kind of blood on our hands. Let's do this. Let's sell him as a slave. Now, I don't know if you and I could really come to grips with this. You know, your brothers throw you in a pit. It's muddy and soggy down there. And they pull you out, and you're like, oh, they came to their senses. I can't believe you guys would do that to me. And instead of freeing you, though, they start wrapping your hands with rope. And you're just wondering, what, what are you doing next? And you see that there's a caravan of camels and donkeys coming, and they walk you over there. And you're just worried, what's going to happen next? And can you imagine your brothers binding your hands together and leading you away? My sister can. So when I was younger and super foolish and, my parents got me these toy handcuffs. It was their fault, okay? You don't give a kid like me toy handcuffs. And I was just curious, do they work? They weren't real handcuffs. So I said, hey, Colette. And she's my youngest sister. I was like, let's see if these work. Why don't you stand up against this light post outside our house? Click. Hey, they work. See ya. See, it's funny, right? The way she tells the story and I tell the story are totally different. Her version goes like, I've been scarred for life. You left me there until the sun came up. And my story is like, I think I went inside and came right back out. It was like 30 seconds. And she was traumatized by it, but it's okay. Nothing that a lot of counseling can't solve. But Joseph, he gets it. I mean, his hands are bound. And later on in the text, it reveals that he's pleading with his brothers. Don't do this. Don't do this. What's Dad going to think? And they hand the end of the rope that's got his hands wound and bound, and he hands it to one of these guys going to Egypt. And they throw some silver at the brothers, and they lead Joseph off. And I don't know if Joseph at one point stops pleading and just gets this understanding that nothing's going to change. And I don't know what the glances at his brothers look like, but I don't know if it's like, one day this is going to come back on you. I'm going to get you, and I'm going to get even with you. Like, you just don't know. You don't know if he's just like sobbing and crying as he's going off. But he's just a young man. And if you know how this story goes, he goes to Egypt, and he's placed in this household, sold as a slave to this guy by the name of Potiphar. Can you imagine being sold as a slave with the kind of knot that puts in your soul? If that's not bad enough, his story goes from bad to worse to worse to worse. He goes to this guy named Potiphar, and it's amazing. Joseph has this uncanny ability for leadership, so when he goes into the house as a slave, he just prospers. Potiphar recognizes his leadership potential, and so he puts him in charge of his entire household. The problem is the text says that Joseph was a good-looking man, and Potiphar's wife kept coming on to him, and he's like, no. Like, this man has entrusted me with his whole house. There's no way I'll ever do this. His wife got so bent out of shape that she accused Joseph of attacking her, and Potiphar believed his wife. What happens next? Joseph's thrown in prison, and he's there for years. Can you imagine the kind of, when you suffer an injustice, where you just go, hey, I know this is wrong, she knows this is wrong, he knows this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening, I didn't do anything to deserve this, this is injustice. Imagine the knot that puts in your soul. So he ends up in prison. And his uncanny leadership ability, it comes out again. And the warden puts him in charge of all of the prisoners. I mean, Joseph's life is like, he looks like he's rising, then boom. And then he looks like he's rising, and boom. He's in charge of all these prisoners. Two of the guys that are there. There's a cupbearer to the king and also a baker. These two guys, they did something wrong. He didn't make good brownies. I don't know. Something went wrong. So the baker and the cupbearer, they make the king mad. They end up in prison, and they each have a dream, and they come to Joseph. And they say, Joseph, we had this dream. Like, what does it mean? And he interprets each of their dreams. He says, for you, the cupbearer, in 3 days, the king's going to restore you to your position. And to the baker, he goes, baker, in 3 days, I hate to tell you this, but he's going to cut off your head, and you're going to die. 3 days later, exact same thing happens. But when he interprets the dream, he tells the cupbearer, he says this. He goes, I want you to do one thing. When you get back to the ear of your king, when you're there before Pharaoh in Egypt, the one thing I ask you is this: do not forget me. Can you see his hope rise? And Joseph says this. He goes, listen, interpreting dreams, that's all up to God. Only God can do that. And in that moment, his hope is rising, like, God, this is the way you're going to get me out of this. It happens just as he said. The baker's killed. The cupbearer, he gets back to the attention of the king, gets his job back. And the text says, and the cupbearer forgot him for 2 years. Joseph's in prison for 2 more years until Pharaoh he has a dream. And the cupbearer hears that he has a dream, and he's like, well, if somebody could interpret this, can you imagine the status of the person who can interpret the Pharaoh's dream? And the cupbearer says, hey, there's this guy in prison. He's in charge of all the prisoners, but he is a prisoner. He interprets dreams. Long story short, the Pharaoh pulls Joseph out, and Joseph interprets his dream. He says this, here's your dream. You're going to have 7 years of plenty. I mean, they're going to have great weather. You're going to plant crops. You're going to bring in a great harvest. But after those 7 great years, you're going to have 7 terrible years of drought, and there's going to be famine. So you need to store up in the 7 good years for the 7 bad years. And Pharaoh, in his wisdom, goes, it seems like you might be the right guy to hire, to say, well, why don't you come in? And Joseph rises to the second in command of all Egypt behind Pharaoh. Here's his job. He's now negotiating with all these people from kind of neighboring communities, even far off lands that would travel for miles during the drought. They're 2 years into the drought. And people would come in and say, we need grain. And he'd be like, okay, you'll get this grain from us because we've been storing for 7 years. And they're 2 years into this drought. And it'll cost you this much, or it'll cost you this land, or it'll cost you this. And he's negotiating. And it's one of those days in his office, in his room, where in comes this next group of people, and he can't believe it. The people that walk in are his brothers. If you've never heard this story, it's like the dramatic moment where they kind of walk in and he recognizes them, but the brothers, they don't recognize him. He looks Egyptian now. In his Egyptian garb, they would have never guessed that he would have risen to the number 2 person in all of Egypt. Stop for a moment. Imagine the knots of Joseph's soul. You know how long it's been? 20 years since they sold him as a slave. Here's the knots of his soul. The first 2, they're on Joseph. Arrogance and offensiveness. I wonder if he, at any point in time, was like, I wish I wouldn't have done what I would have done. I bet you he never said, yeah, I deserved it. But I wish he would have treated his brothers differently. I bet you it's a knot of regret in his own soul. There's definitely a knot of betrayal, abandonment. From Potiphar's wife and Potiphar, distrust and injustice. From his fellow prison mates, being forgotten. The loneliness and despair and depression of being in prison. These are all knots in his own soul. So here's the moment. Ready? The brothers walk in. How will Joseph live out these knots? The scripture never talks about his intent. It just kind of tells the story of what happens. Flip over a couple pages to chapter 42. I want you to see these scenes for yourself. 42 verse 7. Says this, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. In verse 9 there's that little phrase that says, then he remembered. Then he remembered his dreams. I think it's a significant statement about a string that we need to pull, that Joseph definitely needed to pull, and probably each of us does too, as a starting place to start getting untangled. And it's this. It's about remembering. Joseph didn't forget. Maybe he did for a long time, because it seems to say in that text, it insinuates that at that moment he remembered, he recalled all of that. His dream about, oh yeah, they would bow down to me, and now here his brothers are bowing down to him. He's remembering the pain. He's also remembering something else, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. I think the remembering for him is the fact that he wasn't willing to minimize what his brothers had done. Some of y'all, look at me real quick. Some of y'all are minimizers. Because when someone hurts you, you don't want to deal with the pain, so you just go, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's okay. It didn't hurt that bad. And you might actually be convinced of that, but when you react out of anger, bitterness, all of a sudden you realize, no, that really was painful for me. And what we call that is denial, right? That really hurt, that really took place. But here's what else I think it means. When he says he remembered his dream, in one place where the baker comes to him and the cupbearer comes to him, he says this. He says, only God can interpret dreams. Like the meaning of those are up to him. Joseph knew that dreams and the interpretation of dreams, according to Joseph, what he says is only God can do that. So when it says he remembered his dream, I think this is what it means. I think what it means, he's saying, I remember the dreams that God gave me, and now God is producing this in my life. God is bringing that dream to fruition. So what he's seeing is this. Listen, watch. From the time my brothers gave me away into slavery to the time where they actually bowed down for me, God hadn't actually abandoned me in my darkest hours. Let me invite you to do this week. Would you just read Joseph's story this week? Spend a couple days just kind of reading over it. Here's what you're going to find. In multiple places, it makes this statement. And God was with Joseph. You'll find out when he was in Potiphar's house and he was one of the slaves there. It said, and God was with Joseph. And then you get to where he was in prison and it said, and God was with Joseph. And multiple times in his life, it'll say God was with Joseph. And I think what Joseph is saying, by him saying, I remember that God gave me this dream, he remembered his dream. He's saying, I knew God was there with me, and now he brought it to fruition. The truth is this, God's never abandoned me within this. He's recognizing that there's something bigger than just his brother's choice, that God was present. I want to say this, say it carefully. The knots of your soul, whatever that experience was, whatever the face was that was connected with this, I want to tell you this. Listen. Don't worry about that. Listen to this. God was with you. I don't want to pretend like that makes the pain of everything you've experienced in your life, that makes it okay or makes it good. But he was there. Your own regret, rebellion, that kind of thing, I'm just telling you, he was there with you then too. He was there wishing you'd make different choices, but he was there with you. Still loves you. When it was someone else's harm that was being inflicted on you, I'm just saying he was there with you. And sometimes we don't know why God does what he does, but he was there with you. Sometimes I think he's there with us, weeping alongside us when we're experiencing hurt. I think that's what Joseph is stating, that God was with him. Now, the first thing I just said was this, is the first thing we got to do is we got to actually remember what happened. And if you want to add this word, please write this word down, remembering accurately. Not making more of it than what really existed. And not minimizing it, but seeing it how God sees it. But the second thing, it's not in your notes there, but maybe you just write this down. Remembering that God was with us. And he's still with us. For some of you, that'll be a harder thing to come to grips with and kind of sense your way through that. Now, this is critical. I'm going to pick back up the story here because it doesn't end here. Because you kind of want to know, so what does Joseph do to his brothers? Is this like the great revenge story of all time? You need to know this part, though. Joseph, his native language is Hebrew, but he's not speaking to his brothers in Hebrew. He's using an interpreter because he doesn't want to give away the fact that when his brothers are talking in the room, he understands them. Because when his brothers are speaking Hebrew in the room, they think nobody else understands them. So they're having this dialogue, and Joseph's able to understand what it is that they're saying, but they don't know that. That makes this really good. So here we go. Verse 21. They said to one another, this is the brothers talking while he's accusing them of being spies, surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life. They're talking about Joseph. But we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. Reuben replied. Remember who Reuben was? He's like the guy, don't kill him. Just put him in the pit. And he was going to rescue him later. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. Did you get the power of this moment? I mean, you're just waiting for Joseph to explode, but it says this. Joseph turned away from them and he began to weep. All the pain and the knots of his soul, he first of all starts remembering, and he recognizes that God has been with him and that God's still with him, and God's been in the midst of the pain of his life, and all of a sudden, like it's this combustion of his soul is about to take place. He can combust and explode with anger. He can explode with violence, but he doesn't. He explodes with weeping. the stuff in here will come out of us. I guarantee it. How it comes out is a lot up to you. And he says, and it says he had to turn away because he didn't want to see his brothers weeping. One of the things that we have to do to get our souls untangled, it's a string to pull on. It's called grieving. It's going to come out in an unhealthy way or a healthy way. And grieving is one of those ways to get the knots of our soul untangled. And it's actually a string that we got to be willing to pull. It's acknowledging the hurt that sits inside of us. Now, from chapter 42 to the end of his life, if you think I'm making too much about this weeping, grieving concept, I listed to you all of the verses. There's 7 different moments where Joseph has an emotional breakdown and just weeps. And he's grieving. You can check those out this week. Remember, you're going to read his story this week, right? And this moment, you know what his brothers are actually doing? They're having a confession. They're like, I knew we shouldn't have done that. We were so wrong. We were so wrong. Not only that, but get this. This is what Joseph does. He says, here's what we're going to do. You came for grain, I'll give you grain. But I'm going to keep one of your brothers here in prison. And while the rest of you go back to your family, and he says, by the way, tell me about your family. They tell him about his dad, and he says, and these are the brothers, and there's one more younger brother at home, and Joseph perks up. The younger brother he's talking about is not his half-brother, it's actually his real brother, his brother from the same mother. You know what I'm talking about? And he tells him about it. He tells him about their dad who's still alive. He says, so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to keep one of your brothers here. The rest of you can go back with the grain and then bring your younger brother here. And they're like, we can't do that. Dad will never let Benjamin, the younger brother, go because you see, we've lost a brother. They tell Joseph that they've lost a brother. And then they're confessing how they were so wrong in doing it, but they do it in Hebrew so that they think he doesn't understand. Get this. The one brother stays behind so that he hears all this confession and regret, and this one brother stays behind. And the rest of them go. And then they come back and they bring Benjamin. And when Benjamin comes and when Joseph sees his younger brother, boom, the floodgates open again. And then Joseph says this, get this. I know it's complicated, but I'm summarizing all of this. He says, okay, so here's the game plan. Here's what's going to happen. Benjamin stays with me. The rest of you go back and bring your father. And I'm just wondering if Joseph isn't setting his brothers up for a test. And Simeon goes, we can't do that. You don't understand. Our father loves Benjamin so much that if he doesn't come back with us, our father will physically die. He's already lost one son. And Simeon says, take me, let Benjamin go, I'll stay. And get this. Joseph in that moment is watching his brothers care for each other and love each other in a way that they never loved him. But instead of getting bitter, it softens and just breaks down Joseph's heart. It breaks him down so much that he can't take it anymore. Because what he's realizing is they not only confessed, even though they didn't know they were confessing, but he's seeing this softer side of his family, that they're taking care of each other. And that anger and bitterness starts becoming untangled out of his soul. Look at chapter 45, verse 1. 45:1. Here's his breaking moment. 45:1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself because before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him outside of the room. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. I don't know how I'd feel if I was one of those brothers, but just, what do you say? There's nothing you can say, but in this moment, this is just one of the emotional 7 breakdowns that he has where weeping and grieving overtake him. Now, the grieving process. Psychologists have written an awful lot about this. Some people say there's 5 steps in the grieving process. Here's what it looks like. Some have said 7. Other people have made much longer processes. Here's just one example of like, you have hurt or loss. And you start emotionally going down, and there's shock, numbness, denial. Maybe it's emotional outbursts, anger, fear. And you just kind of keep working your way down there, panic, guilt, loneliness, isolation, depression. But then it starts swinging up in the other direction, and you start developing new relationships and new connections, new strengths. By the way, you can Google any of this, and it'll pop right up. New patterns of dealing with things, hope, affirmation. Then you take your pain and you turn around, you're able to help others. Helping others is like almost like the full circle of this. And like, doesn't this look neat and tidy? Like, oh, I have a knot in my soul. I just need to go through these stages, and then I'll get on the other side. Somebody, I don't know who put this online, but you could tell, like, they don't buy the whole, oh, life just looks like this. And like, here's how my old stages of grieving go. Yeah, there you go. I think this is more like how it actually happens. We're kind of a total mess at times. And so can I just give you permission right now? You ready? Hey, for these next 5 weeks and maybe even ongoing from here, we're just going to get this started. We're not going to solve everybody's knots in their souls. God probably won't do that in the next 5 weeks. But there's an invitation for you and I to get some tools about how we deal with it in the future. But let me just say this. I give you complete permission to be messy with this. To say, God, I don't have a clue. God, I just know that I'm mad right now. I just know that he shouldn't have done that. She shouldn't have done that. I know I should have never done that. I don't even think I can forgive myself. Let it be messy. Joseph. Here's how this looks in verse 4. This is critical. He's already said, hey, I'm Joseph. I'm your brother. And then he does this. Look at verse 4. Underline this. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. He says, come here. I don't want you far away. I want you close to me. And when he had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. 2 things happened here. You ready? The first is this. He said, come here. I don't think he's saying, come here so I can punch you. Come here so I can strangle you. I think he's making a statement about what he wants. He's saying, brothers, come here. I don't want you far away. I want you close. I don't want distance. I don't want you to be down there and me to be up here. I don't want you to be bowing down and me to be over you. Brothers, come here and I want you close. It's a statement about what we want. And the truth and the reality is this. Every single one of us in this room today, we want that same thing. We want the people that in our families and our friends, we want them close. And there's things that they have said and done, things you've said and done that creates space. Because the truth of the scripture is this, is that sin separates people from God and from each other. And he makes this statement, coming close, about what he wants. I'm just curious, would you be willing to state that to the people that maybe their face is connected to the knot in your soul, that you'd be willing to say, hey, I want you close. And maybe you're not willing to say that yet. You can say it to God, you can say it to yourself, but maybe you can't say it to them yet. But listen to what else he said. He didn't just say, hey, come close. He doesn't minimize his pain. He says, come close to me. And when they had done so, now they're close. They're in proximity, right there, face to face. He says, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. The one you sold as a slave. Get this. This is important. The first is this. I want you close. But the second is this. I'm not going to minimize what you did. We're going to sit in the pain of the fact of what you guys did to me. There's something powerful in that. For those of y'all that don't like conflict, underline that verse. Make a little placard for your home, okay? Because you need to live into this. You need to lean into this. Say, don't minimize, don't deny, but walk into this and say, you know, there's some things that people did to me. Or maybe it's, you need to look at what you've done. If you're in the category of regret and the knot is your face. I think what he's doing, though, is he's grieving with hope. He's grieving this thing, but he's doing it in hope. Now, let's do this. One final thought before we leave Joseph's story. Verse 5. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land. In the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing and reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. This is the point I was trying to make earlier. By him recognizing that dreams only come from God, God gave him that dream. God was with him in prison when he helped him interpret those dreams from the cupbearer and the baker and also from Pharaoh. I mean, God was with him through the whole thing. And he just recognized this. He says, I'm here in Egypt to save our family. Not only that, but get this. The whole family comes to Egypt. And he sees his dad before his dad dies. The family's reunited. He gives them a plot of land that they can be on. And then his dad passes away. And it's another moment where he loses it again. He just weeps. He grieves over the death of his dad. And at that time, over the death of his dad, you know what his brothers do? They get together and they go, maybe now he's going to take revenge on us. Now that dad's gone, now that dad's not there to be like, hey, you wouldn't do that in front of dad, would you, Joseph? Now that that whole thing is gone, and this happens, doesn't it? Parents die, and all of a sudden it's like, now that mom and dad aren't there to like give us guilt or shame, people go off the rails, and the brothers are thinking, now Joseph's going to get us. Joseph has this moment, he finds out, and he weeps again, like, I can't believe you guys would doubt me. So Genesis 50, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Hey, the knots in your soul, they may have gotten there with a lot of pain, and it was not good. But God can take whatever happened here and bring it to a place today where he says, I want you to pull on the string of remembering. I want you to pull on the string, the understanding that I've always been there. I want you to pull on that string of grieving and let it come out in a way that's appropriate. That's the invitation. By the way, it's a really similar invitation to what Jesus gives us. And we'll get into this next couple weeks. We're going to switch to Jesus and how he deals with people. But can I just read to you what Jesus said in Matthew 11? Listen to this, and we'll end here. He said, come to me. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Hey, pull up here. Get close. I want you to come to me. All of you who were weary and burdened. All of you who are carrying something that you shouldn't be carrying. Essentially, he's saying this. All of you whose souls are tangled up in knots, here's what I want you to do. Come close to me, because that's where I want you. And then he says, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and I'm humble in heart. And you'll find, here it is, rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Here's why Jesus makes that. You find out later on in his life after he dies and is resurrected. But here it is. Jesus' invitation reminds us that he paid for our sins and their sins so relationships could be restored. Remember the face attached to the knot? Listen, whatever face is there, Jesus died for that face. And he died for that deed that was done against you, or he died for the deed that you did that's still a knot in your own soul. Listen, Jesus died for those things. And he says, come close. I want you close to me. Because I died for those things, and I'm going to give you rest for your soul. If that's a promise from Christ, we're going to take a look in the next 4 weeks, like, what are the other strings to pull? And he gives us some. So here's my invitation this week. Ready? Read the story of Joseph. Not just the front part, but particularly the back part. I mean, if you know the front part that I just read to you, feel free to read that again. But go to the back part of his story about his grieving, his remembering, his weeping, and see if God might bring a face to mind that maybe there's a knot there that you didn't even know existed before. Maybe you know what it is. One of the things that I do to try and figure out a knot in my soul is I just write down how I'm feeling, keep it in a journal, and keep people from looking at it. Maybe you'll write stuff down this week and just say, God, what's going on in my own soul? And read that this week. Are we good? Hey, let's bow our heads. Let's pray. Lord, big knots, little knots, they're all still knots, and they sometimes wreck us. God, sometimes they create outbursts in my own life and relationships with people that are unhealthy, and sometimes it's in those outbursts that I never even knew I had a knot there, and yet it's there. So God, I want to make really clear before you, Lord, that I'm not teaching pop psychology. I believe this is directly from your word. that there are things that we need to do for the health and healing of our own soul so that we can have healthy relationships with each other. And so God, as we read this week, I pray you'd speak to us. I know you do. You always speak through your word. And we just want to trust that. But God, help us to diligently go after it and just ask the question and be fearless in the midst of this. Because God, I recognize that there can be a fear to really explore in our own souls and the knots in there. But God, help us to be fearless and hopeful that on the other side of this, there's life and hope and a better life than we have today. And so God, give us courage to do that this week. And if you agree with that, would you say amen?